Hi, good evening, and welcome for those who are joining us both in person and online. My name is Morgan Lavender. I'm a licensed clinical mental health counselor, and I've been honored to be a part of this series so far. We are glad you're joining us tonight for our series. As a part of the series, Don't Mention It, a quote that came from Fred Rogers, that anything that is human is mentionable, and anything that is mentionable is manageable. So tonight, we are going to have a conversation about grief, which is something that has impacted most all of us. I do want to give a reminder that we will have a question and answer at the end tonight. So please feel free at any time to text your questions about grief to 704-901-8898. And those questions, we'll have a question and answer around 8 o'clock. We'll have some time to be able to respond to those. For those in person or online, again, the number is on the screen, 704-901-8898. But I am honored to be here tonight with Ken and Jessica as we talk about grief and share the stage with them, but I'm going to let them introduce themselves. Ken?
Hi, my name is Ken Grano. I am a certified fee-based practicing pastoral counselor. Say that 5 times in a row. With the state of North Carolina. My background, I was a grief counselor and hospice chaplain for about 7 years. Prior to that, worked in the hospital system, and I am currently with Sure Hope Counseling. Pleasure to be here.
Hello, and I am Jessica Diller. I am an LCSW, a licensed clinical social worker, licensed in North Carolina and South Carolina. And my background, I started in oncology and worked a lot across the lifespan with children impacted by cancer diagnoses, their families, as well as children who had a parent or someone else in their household impacted. And then I did a lot of other work with life-threatening and chronic illnesses within the hospital system. And now I've been in private practice a little bit over 4 years, and I am also a registered play therapist and specialize in grief and illness and other medical traumas. And I am at Grace Lane Counseling.
So one of the things that we do every week is we start with kind of the same definition so that everyone can be on the kind of the same page. And so to start us out, how would you define grief?
I guess I'll start. I would say grief is the reaction to a loss, physical, spiritual, emotional, mental. I think it encompasses your entire being, and it can affect everything about your life. So I would say overall, just a nutshell definition is grief is the reaction to a loss. And we'll get into this, I'm sure, but talking about different kinds of losses, it doesn't just have to be the death of a loved one, although that certainly is part of that. So I'll just stop there.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that too, kind of in terms of loss, it can be loss of, a relationship, any type of change that people have moved on from, whether you've lost it or you've kind of moved to a different part of your life. People grieve that. And so it looks differently for different people and in different stages in your life. But it really is your reaction. That's a good word to the loss of something in your life or around you.
So kind of with that setting, are there any what you would call misconceptions out there about grief?
Where to begin?
So many. I think, we've talked a lot. I think people think it has to look a certain way. You have to grieve in a certain amount of time. Oh, they're not grieving yet. Something must be wrong with them. Or I think there's also this concept of socially unacceptable grief. There's types of grief that we don't recognize as a society, such as the death of an ex-spouse or, early miscarriages, loss of a job or different types of relationships. We don't, as a society, recognize those as important griefs as you would, grieving the death of a close loved one or something like that.
Yeah, I guess the only thing I would add there is kind of almost like you can't win for losing with the standards that are imposed sometimes for those who are grieving. So if it's, you should be grieving by now, there's not an external expression of grief, so therefore you are not grieving is a myth. There have been broadly spoken about these two categories of grief: intuitive grieving and instrumental grieving. And it's not like you are either one or the other per se, but at the same time, you might be more of the instrumental is kind of considered more task-oriented, more I want answers, I want to explore the nature of grief, those kind of things, where the intuitive is more the emotionally expressive, outwardly expressive. I want to process this, I want to name the emotions, I want to look through this and kind of feel those feelings with another person. So I think you have to honor the way in which you grieve, sometimes called a grieving style. And so I think that's important to know too. And also, you get people that say, it's been X amount of time. Shouldn't you be at this point by now? And that's another myth. It doesn't have a timeline. I personally don't think you get over grief. You learn how to live with it. You learn how to cope with the loss. It's something that's not going to change, but you can change things about your life to cope with it and to adjust. But you don't get over it, so to speak.
So one of the things you just mentioned were different styles of grief, and there's also a lot of information out there on stages of grief. So Matt talked about this on Sunday, and it's the most common 5 stages of grief by Kubler-Ross. But there are other theories and other stages out there. So for people who may not know, who may be listening, what are some of those other, whether it's the 5 stages of grief or some of the other theories, what are some of those areas out there that maybe they could look into more in terms of other ways to look through grief?
Trying to be nice. There are a lot, actually. So a couple that come to mind to me are William Worden has tasks of grieving. So he defines 4 tasks of grieving. There's a person by the name of Rando who has 6 R's of grieving. Alan Wolfelt, and I hope I'm saying his name correctly, talks about this companionship type of grieving. I will definitely not say this name right. So if you know it, I don't know, it's Nehemiah. He's out of Memphis State, or it used to be Memphis State. I'm from Memphis. So I went to Memphis State when it was Memphis State. So it's University of Memphis, so my apologies there. But he has a very meaning-oriented style of approaching grief. All in all, though, I think a lot of these have a lot of common similarities. So, most of these will talk about accepting the loss, experiencing the pain of the loss, remembering the person who died. And remember really could be said, and this is from a book, it's not from me, RE-membership. So you're bringing them into your life in a new way, that they have a different kind of membership in your life. Kind of goes into this idea of continuing a bond with that person. But that's not without qualification. If it was not a good relationship, you may not want to continue that bond. And that gets into some complicated grief issues too. So that could be another thing we talk about. But then also identity comes into that, a sense of who I am now. I think I'm a little partial to the Christian faith, I have to say. I think there's a core identity we have there. But maybe what you may consider secondary identities. If you did suffer the loss of a spouse, sometimes in my experience with speaking to people who have lost a spouse, the social circles they had before are not as available to them. And that's unfortunate because they had these connections of community they may not have anymore. And they start to see the unfortunate reality that can be their reality, not definitively, that the people saw me as a couple, not as an individual. So who am I as an individual now? What's my identity? And then what's my purpose in life? So a lot of big questions can come out of grief and loss. And that's why I think a lot of these theorists have included these in the process. And there's other models, but I'll let you speak.
Well, and you touched a lot on kind of adult topics, so I'll shift to kind of children, because I think people have this expectation of children's grieving process based on what it looks like for adults to grieve, and children grieve very differently than adults do. And for a lot of children, I think their grief happens over their lifespan. For adults, it does too, but it happens differently for children because they haven't experienced all of the life events that we have as adults. And so their grief will manifest as they experience new things in their life, maybe without that person, or when they're a child, they don't know, oh, I'm not gonna have my mom or my dad or my grandparent here to do this until they get to that moment. And then they realize, oh my gosh, I'm doing this without them. And they almost re-grieve again at that point. and the grieving process will look differently based on the different points in their life that they're at. But people expect children to just kind of go through it all right then and there, and it typically takes children a lot longer to grieve, or the permanency of a loss to set in for them, because they don't have that concept down like we do. And so people kind of get concerned about children, like, oh, they're running around at the funeral having fun. Do they not realize? But to a lot of children, that's a comment I get a lot. And parents are like, what's wrong with them? Why are they like laughing? And do they not get this? And to some degree, yes, they don't get it. But also, people forget that at funerals, a lot of people that are important to you come and show up. And it's a big gathering for those children. And so they see family that they haven't seen in a long time, or their friends or special teachers or other important people in their lives come. And that's very exciting to them. So children will get excited. And I think also children will tend to put on a happy face a lot of times, because we as parents work very hard in our whole lives to protect our children. But what we don't recognize is that our children do that for us also. And so they will sometimes, if they know, especially after a recent death, there's lots of tears and sadness and things going on around them, they will try to be the family clown or comedian to try to cheer everyone up and try to not show that they're feeling sad, because they're worried if they cry, they're going to make another loved one in their house cry. And so you kind of have to, and so sometimes people think kids aren't grieving or don't understand or aren't processing, but they do kind of in their own way. And, being able to share that time with special people, if, during a service, or you get a lot of people coming to visit after, that's very therapeutic for them in their own right.
Would you add anything else? You talked about children, anything else about teenagers? So a lot of the same elements still would apply, but anything in particular about how teenagers would grieve?
Yeah, and my point for teenagers would be another good point for children that I didn't bring up is I think the biggest thing I see with teens is anger comes out. And children do this too. So if it's someone in their life that has died, or they have another significant loss of like a peer or even a peer group just moving away, not necessarily a death, but a loss in general. When children and teens experience anxiety, adults do it also, but it's more common. You typically see that manifest in symptoms of anger, what you would describe as anger. And a lot of people don't recognize that as anxiety. But when we're feeling anxious, we tend to be a little more snappy and have a little more harsh response, because inside we're panicking, whether we need to, deciding whether we're going to fight or flight. And so quite often that anger gets misplaced on either the parent or whoever caregiver or the other group that's still with that child or teen. They get the brunt of that anger, and they're like, I'm still here, I'm taking care of them, I'm not the one that left, but they're mad at me. And it's just because they feel safe in that space to show that, those vulnerable feelings, and they don't have to put on the brave front for everybody around them like they do in the world. At home, they can be comfortable, and that's where it tends to land, even though they're usually very grateful for that person that's still there with them, but it doesn't always come out like that.
So how about with adults? We have different types of grieving styles and different types of grief. So what does grief look like in adults?
Well, I guess it varies. I think, to your point, there's a uniqueness to teenagers and how they grieve, and children how they grieve. I would say sometimes with adults, the anger piece can be actually denied sometimes, because we're told in this society sometimes that anger is flat out wrong. And I know you all did a series just on anger alone, which is great, because, to get to, we can be angry. We can be angry at a felt abandonment sometimes. That's just one example of that. So, to be very real and to find a space where you can be very real about that, it doesn't have to be quote unquote true that they left me and abandoned me, but to be honest about that feeling of abandonment, the feeling of being left behind, that's something to work through, because that is a legitimate pain. And I think that's the thing, to legitimize the pain and to name the pain is key. Other things that are more or less common are yearning for the loved one, almost sometimes expecting to see them. I remember reading someone saying that there's an assumed presence of that individual because depending on who they are, how long they've been in your life, the quality of the relationship, these things you can almost assume they're going to be there. In a sense, you feel like you forget because you could have sworn you saw them come around the corner, and then it hits you again like a ton of bricks that they're not here and they're not coming back. And again, I'm talking about the death of a loved one. This could be related to physical losses of your own self and different types of losses that happen. Maybe you all have heard of the phantom limb for somebody who has an amputation, right? You assume that part of you is still there. And then the harsh reality when maybe you get up in the morning and that part of you isn't there. How do you work through that? How do you adjust to life? And so disorientation, I mean, it can go on and on. I sometimes give this handout with grief is like and it's not exclusive to me. I think other people use this, but it's kind of this whole intertwined ball of emotion, because we can feel this chaotic aspect of grief too. Everything can seem disorganized and not make sense. And so, it's just, I won't give too specific examples, but I had people that were so not with the world that they made decisions they wouldn't otherwise make in their lives, like buying a car online. They weren't even knowing they were doing that. That's how powerful it can be. And then there's also the physical responses. I always tell people, get checked out medically, because I'm not a doctor. I'm not going to say, oh yeah, your high blood pressure, that's grief. I'm not a doctor, right? So please go see somebody, get checked out, make sure you're okay. But there are a lot of physical responses to grief as well. So, keeping that in mind, that when you're grieving, you will have physical responses too.
And hearing you say that too, I think one of the things that comes to mind for me also is, this is a little bit of the misconception, but people, you see people have almost a sense of relief sometimes after the death or a change, a loss of something, and people are like, what? How can you be okay with that? But if you've been with somebody who's been suffering for so long, whether it be an illness or something else happening, they've begun the grief process long before you have, as a person on the outside of that circle. Because if it's called anticipatory grief. Like, something is changing, you're going to lose someone. They've started that grief process months before. From the moment they found out there was a chance that they would be having that loss, you already start grieving. And I think people from the outside don't recognize that if you haven't been in that boat. So you see a lot of people with, experiencing, especially in faith communities, joy over, knowing that their loved one is no longer suffering, no longer hurting, in pain. And they've gone through a lot of that shock of not having them, and have mentally prepared themselves as much as they possibly could before that actual death. And I think a lot of people that haven't been sitting in that seat don't recognize that or aren't aware that that's happening. So it can be surprising or shocking to see people almost having a sense of relief at that moment. And also, if you've been a caregiver to someone for years or months or days, that can be taxing on you. And so to not have to be that person to somebody who you weren't intended to be their caregiver can be very relieving also.
You reminded me of something in that too. Relief is okay, right? Sometimes a big reaction is guilt. Sometimes feeling guilty, all right? And guilty because maybe I feel relief. Is there something wrong with me? So to your point, I've been working so hard. It's that anticipatory grief, as you mentioned. It's what's been called ambiguous loss. You're losing somebody along the way. And so, you feel like that identity of that person has been disappearing. And so you've grieved the relationship because it's changed. through time. And so you've learned how to process, to your point. And then so feeling that relief, sometimes you may feel guilty. You may feel guilty for other reasons too. One that I hear often is, I feel guilty because I had a good day, right? Am I betraying my loved one in some way because I had a good day? No, that's not the case, but let's talk through that. Tell me about that. What would your loved one think about you having a good day? Those kind of things, so, yeah.
So on that, we've talked a lot about how people come to accept or how to adjust to it, whether it was sudden and shocking, whether it was time to prepare. So while everyone grieves differently, what are some of the things people can do to work towards an acceptance or an adjustment to the loss?
In the child world, we talk a lot about, and I mentioned this before, how children try to protect parents and parents work to protect children. And a lot of times parents think that they shouldn't bring up that person because they don't want to upset the child, or the child will avoid talking about a loss because they don't want to upset other people. And one of the things I always recommend is that you keep that person alive in your house and in your family by continuing to talk to them. Oh, what do you think grandma would have thought about this? Or what do you think dad would have wanted, for dinner tonight? And keeping them, because just because that person has physically died, they still are that person to you. They're still a part of your life. They live on through you. You had that relationship with them. And I think people forget that, and it becomes almost taboo to talk about the death of a person, and people don't want to come up and say, oh, I've been thinking about you, because there is that traditional, it's almost about that 6-week mark, and everybody kind of drops off and goes back to their normal life, and here you are still sitting in that grief. And that's a lot of times when the grief kind of takes over, because you've been so busy with with whatever change you have, because changes take a lot. But with the death of a person, there's a lot of tasks that have to be done. With the change of a job or different things, like you're busy, getting into a new job, whatever the loss may be, a move from a new community, and you're getting oriented. After kind of that first phase is over, it hits, and then people are it's so easy to talk to someone about the death immediately after it happens, but months later, other people tend to shy away from bringing it up because they don't want to upset you. They don't want to hurt your feelings. But then the person that is actually grieving feels like nobody remembers. Everybody's already forgotten, when that's not the case, but both sides are trying to tiptoe around the other side, and nobody wants to hurt anybody's feelings. But I think it's important to help people and recognize that people are grieving constantly, and for most people, it's not going to upset them or offend them for you to say, hey, I was thinking about Bob today. Something in my mind popped in my mind, and I thought about Bob, and I thought you would want to know. I think about him often, and I still miss him. Things like that. And I think that helps, back to your original point, people adjusting to that loss, is knowing that other people still remember that person or that change as well.
Yeah. I think that's such a good point too, on many levels, and also saying their name can speak volumes. In speaking with people whose loved ones have died, just saying their name, they can say thank you for saying their name. When I think about the acceptance and the adjustment, sometimes acceptance, we can think of denial in that, just in the sense of not talking about it, right? So as I hear you ask that question, it makes me think of, what is acceptance? So what would acceptance not be, so to speak? And I think, looking at ways in which you may be denying the loss, I think one of the obvious ones is one I just said, would be to almost deny that they've died. That does happen. And again, I'm thinking of somebody who's died. It could be denial of an illness. Working in hospice, I've encountered that a lot, especially when I was on the chaplain side of things. You get an initial diagnosis, but you feel okay. And so some people struggle with, I don't know if it's really true. So yeah, get the second opinion. Do what you have to do to help process that and affirm it. Go for it. But when it keeps coming back that here are the x-rays, here are the scans, this is happening, there may be these stages of denial people go through because I feel okay. But even after that, you can still deny that reality. So you're denying the reality. That to me is the most kind of quote unquote obvious one. But other ways that you can deny it is simply by minimizing it, minimizing the relationship, minimizing what maybe even an occupation, for example, meant to you. Because if you have a loss of a dream, a loss of a job that you worked hard to get and now it's gone, that happened a lot in COVID, right? We had actual death in COVID, and then we had people who were suffering all these other kind of losses too, like loss of work, loss of a sense of purpose. And one way to deny that it's really affecting you to the depth that it is to say, well, it's not a big deal, I can always find another job. Or I really, I love them, but they really got on my nerves, and at least I don't have to live with this anymore. Now, that might be true. You might be happy not to have to live with fill in the blank, but at the same time, you might be minimizing the pain of the loss. So I think kind of having those in mind about how I may not be fully accepting this loss. Another way not to accept is to stay really, really busy. Excellent point about the realities. If you're dealing with the loss of a loved one, the paperwork and all the things you have to do, it's almost like you need to become a lawyer to understand everything you have to do. And it's so taxing. You're already grieving, and then you have to do all this stuff. It's really, it's a burden. But that can keep you away from feeling some of the pain. And to your point, when it's done, that pain can settle in. And sometimes you think, oh, I haven't really grieved. Well, maybe, but also sometimes you're in a shock for a while, and then it's setting in. So it's not like you're backtracking. That's something I hear people are concerned about, thinking about coping and adapting. Oh, I haven't really faced it. Well, not necessarily. Maybe it's the shock of it. And now you're just coming out of that. That's wearing off. And now you're feeling the pain. Now you can go into the pain and process that, which I think is a really, really important part of learning how to adjust, is to really accept the pain for what it is and work through that pain. And then you go into some of the things I mentioned before with finding a new sense of identity, finding something meaningful in your life that you can hang on to. As you mentioned so well, continuing bonds with that person, sharing stories about them, introducing them to somebody else. We're coming around the holidays soon, so there might be traditions you want to keep. There might be traditions you don't want to keep. There might be a place at the table you want to have for that person, cook their favorite meal, on and on it goes.
So often people ask what's normal, right? What's the time frame? I'm backsliding. I didn't hit this stage. I already did this stage, are common things with people who are grieving. So is there a normal? We've talked a little bit about it, but is there a normal? And if not, what are signs that maybe someone does need a little bit more help? Or maybe signs that other people could recognize that, hey, maybe they need someone else to process with?
I think a lot of times, there is no normal. We'll say that. It's situational. It's based on your family's beliefs. It's based on your traditions, the relationship you had with that person, or, it's going to look different. And you may grieve two different people or two different situations totally different. And grief lasts a lifetime, especially when talking about loss and death. But I think some of the signs to look for, and with children or teens, I'll kind of speak to that, is if you see a lot of, you'll start maybe seeing physical symptoms, which we always recommend you do get evaluated by a medical provider, but you do see symptoms manifest, stomach aches, things like that, not wanting to be away from other caregivers, having trouble concentrating at school, loss of appetite, and for these things to go on, for months at a time. And it's not like at the 6-month mark, okay, everything should go away. But if you see these symptoms happening regularly and persistent, then that's kind of the two terms that I use, regularly and persistent, for a period of several months or longer, is when I usually recommend to parents, if they're not already. Some people will get kids and teens in counseling right away, just to get them established with somebody to build rapport if they are continuing to have lingering not issues, but lingering worries and having trouble kind of moving past and figuring out how to integrate life and make changes, I will recommend, that they go ahead and get them to see somebody, because it might be that the kids are having trouble, or teens especially, they don't want to talk to someone in their own house. They want to talk about things that they've not been comfortable sharing. So it's helpful for them to see somebody that is a neutral party, that they can say things that they might want to shelter their parents from.
I remember in hospice we would say that grief is a normal response to an abnormal event. We hope that you don't have many of these events often in your life, although there are multiple losses, which is really difficult to deal with. But I guess I would just say, to add on, really kind of repeating what you said, that persistence part is a good point and very key. I think for me, it's a matter of the rumination, the yearning, all of that makes sense. But if it gets to a point where it's really overtaking your life and you can't do some of the activities of daily living and functioning, whether it be at your workplace, your other relationships are significantly suffering, you withdrawn for a very long time, like you're saying, months and months and months on end, those are some quote-unquote red flags that maybe you need a little extra help. So that's all I would add.
You both have alluded to this. Can we talk a little bit more about people who go in and out of, hey, it's hard right now, and then I grieve again, and then I go back to normal, and then I grieve again? Can we talk a little bit more about those cycles that people might go through in their lifetime?
Yeah, I think one of the things that comes to mind for that something you said earlier reminded me is everybody hears about the year of first. You go through that first year of all the first things you do without that person. And I think most people mentally prepare themselves for that year of first, and everybody surrounds them. And, I have a list of, in my personal life, I will write down in my calendar so I remember to check in with somebody on the anniversary of something, or a loved one's birthday that they've lost, and say, I'm thinking about you on this day, things like that. And so we're really good about remembering that whole year first. But for a lot of people, after the first year, they're prepared for that one, but it's the subsequent years that gets them, because for a lot of people, they re-grieve the longer they've been away from someone. And they, like you said, they'll almost have guilt, like, oh, I went the whole day and didn't think about that person. And then they go into this whole guilt or shame and think, I don't remember them enough. I'm not thinking about them. Or a major life event will happen, and they will grieve almost the loss of that person all over again without having them there. Or someone close will lose, or someone, kind of parallel to you will have a similar loss, and then you empathize a lot and sharing that grief with them, almost, for yourself, and then with them also.
Not much to add to that. That was really good, comprehensive. You just reminded me, I suppose, though, of the grief, we call them grief triggers, all right? Where you're going along, and I kind of liken it, for lack of a better word of saying it, like a sucker punch. It's the only best analogy I can think of, but you're just kind of going through your day and you think everything's just fine, and then something will happen. You'll see something, smell something, hear something, and you're right back in your grief again. And so, yeah, you can ebb and flow in that regard. And honestly, too, the only thing I would add, apart from just that and what you said, is sometimes you need to take an intentional break from it. You can't necessarily just cut it off and say, okay, I'm done. But at the same time, you need to have, if you can, to the degree that you can, have intentional time away from doing the grief work. And I say grief work intentionally because as difficult as it is, it's work. It's work to look into these things and to face the reality of what this is and to try to discover a new sense of self. All these things are hard to do. And so you can get exhausted in that. And so you need to have time away from it. Sometimes you do need to be, quote unquote, busy doing other things. Getting into something you enjoy to the degree that you can enjoy it. It doesn't have to be big things. But getting out and doing something where you feel like you have a handle on life is important. I said earlier that you can be too busy, but you can also not be busy enough sometimes. Going back to work at the right time, That's very subjective and not always in our control. Don't get me on that soapbox, by the way. We can go there if we need to have time. But, getting back, I've heard from plenty of people, this has helped me feel like I have some sense of normalcy again. There's predictability in this. I understand this. This grief stuff over here, I'm still struggling with understanding my world here. So I need to go into this world here and work here so I have some sense of sanity and control. So.
One of the things that we've talked a lot about in this series is how to walk along someone who is dealing with something. So how to walk along someone who is grieving. What do we say? What do we not say? So we've had a lot of conversation for a person who might be grieving, but what would you say to those who are walking alongside them? What not to say, what to say, how do you best support them?
The first thing I would say is what a lot of people need, and people are not always good at it, is sometimes you don't need to say anything. You can just be present with them, and I literally mean that, sitting beside them. And not, people struggle with silence, but some people need silence, or they just need to talk and have someone listen and not comment or say, oh yeah, when Betty Sue lost her husband, she did this and this, and that. They just need you to hear them, and know that you are supporting them and loving them unconditionally in that moment, no matter how their grief looks or how they're presenting in that time. And I think a lot of us feel like we need to say something. We have to have something prepared, but I would caution you to step back and think, like, can I just be with this person? Can I just walk up to you and give you a hug and not need to say anything at all?
Amen. And so I think that is the number one thing. And I like how you even phrased the question because of that. You started, I think, with how are you with somebody? That's something that I can't emphasize enough. So yes, absolutely agree with that. The way you are with somebody speaks volumes. And I know you worked in hospitals, I think. So yeah, so I'm sure you've had these experiences. I remember being a chaplain in neurosurgical intensive care units where people are on life support. And you have people who are sitting by their loved one not knowing what's going to happen, and just in these big question marks of life, living in between. And so what are you going to say at a time like that can really impact them versus how are you with them? And the way in which you're present, it matters, right? I mean, you have to be intentionally there, tending to them. Like you said, asking permission for, a hug or a hand, on your shoulder. Let me sit next to you. And I'll tell you, to be honest, I struggled with that when I started because I like things to happen, right? Any amens out there maybe, right? I like things to happen. I like to see things, quote unquote, happen, to be produced, to see end results. So I struggled for a long time sitting with people. But the more I did it, the more I realized how much that meant to that person. Maybe I would say a silent prayer to myself for them. But it was intentionally thinking about what is it like to be them right now, trying to get into their world to the best that I possibly could. And then how is that going to help me determine how I will be present with them? And as far as saying anything, things you don't want to say, I think we could all speak a lot to that, but they're in a better place. That may be true, but they don't want them there. Look, I mean, at the end of the day, yes, I have a lot of confidence in where somebody goes, and that gives me comfort. But the timing matters. Okay, that might be something you get to. It ultimately will give comfort. I do believe that. But in the time, if it's fresh, especially, I would not advise that. You'll be okay. You'll find a way through this. I mean, that's okay. But at the same time, you don't want to get ahead of them. Right now, if they're in a place where it's a fresh wound, just tend to the wound. If you ever feel like you don't know what to say and you feel helpless, you can say that. I find that even in my counseling, I do that. If I am honestly struggling with how to help somebody, I might say, I'm feeling kind of like I really want to know how to help you, and I'm feeling kind of powerless right now. I can imagine you're feeling something like that too. And that actually can link you up with that person. And then you can get to the places that I can now help you. But let's start with the anchor. I hope that makes sense. Because then you're entering their world, not trying to pull them out when they're not ready to come out of it yet.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Being present with them where they're at and not trying to cheer them up, not trying to pull them to a different place, but honoring and respecting where they're at and just walking alongside of them in that moment. One of the things that this is talked about a lot, but I think it's important to emphasize is we all say, let me know how I can help. Well, they honestly most times cannot tell you how they need help, or they can't think through like, oh yeah, it would be really nice if you could go get my daughter at soccer practice at 3:00 today and take her here so I can sit quietly for 10 minutes here or get this done. But recognizing who their main support people are and knowing who knows kind of their schedule and their needs. And if you're not one of those people, going to one of those people and saying, hey, what do you think would be beneficial? And then you either showing up and just dropping the food on the porch and saying, you know, I brought you dinner, you can eat it tonight, you can stick it in the freezer. Or, hey, why don't I come pick up your kids and take them to my house to play for 3 hours so that you can get this done, or you can just have some quiet time to yourself. But being proactive and finding out things that would be helpful and just saying, hey, I'm going to do this without stepping on their toes and overstepping. You don't want to be all up in someone's space, but finding a few intentional things that can help them, because we all are well-meaning when we say, just please let me know what I can do, how I can help. But in reality, that's not usually something that people are in a space to be able to come up with, or they're not going to feel comfortable reaching back out and saying, I would really like it if you could bring me dinner on Tuesday, different things like that.
So we have just a few more minutes. Is there anything that you would encourage people to say who are walking along someone who maybe is re-experiencing grief, or it's one of those new stages of life and they're kind of re-experiencing a long-term grief? Is there anything in particular that you would encourage people to say or do differently in that situation versus a recent grief?
I'll just throw something out there. I think, I just said encourage at the right time, But I think highlighting their ability, maybe not getting into unpacking that, but encouraging them and acknowledging their pain now. That, unfortunately, you've experienced something like this before. It's always different, I believe. It's always different. It's always unique. But you have gone through this, and you can, but at your time and at your pace. Do it the way you need to do it, and find the right people to surround yourself with to help you with that. That won't, again, try to pull you and drag you somewhere, but will be truly present with you to help you in this time in your healing process. I'm a believer in resiliency. I think we can get too focused on what you can't do, but that what you can do needs to be communicated, I think, with wisdom as well, and with the right timing and pacing as well. And of course, again, I think faith can really, really come in as an anchor, as it says, for the soul. Where is God in this for you? And how can I be cooperating with him, with you, and for you in this?
All right, so I'm going to switch over. We have a lot of questions that have come in. So I am going to switch over to a few of the questions that have come in. So Ken, I'm going to start with you. How does one cope with the losses during aging, like lack of energy, capacity, or that dreams won't be realized?
So the first thing that comes to mind for me, and this may not be absolutely comprehensive, so I can jump in, but it hits me as finding and discovering meaning to me is very important in all stages of life. And that can become more challenging as you age because of, as that person said, the energy levels, dreams that may have not been fulfilled, those kind of things. What I tend to focus on there is meaning found in your attitude. And I don't mean that like, hey, have a better attitude, but how can I stand? How can I kind of confront things that I cannot change? If that makes sense. So if I don't have the energy any longer to do this thing, maybe I do. Maybe it's a matter of taking it in smaller pieces than I used to have to. And so maybe it's a matter of I just have to renegotiate that. But if there are things that I'm encountering because of aging, because of limitations, because this dream will no longer be able to be realized, is there any value in how you face that? In other words, the dream itself has a value in itself to me. Whether it was actualized or not, that's something to mourn. I think you can mourn that. But I think that you dreamed and dared to dream can have value. An example would be, do we still give value to the missionary who had the dream to go to a country, into a tribe that as they were going, very unfortunately, the helicopter got shot down, right? We've heard of things like that, right? Where people didn't get to their destination, and yet we still say, what do we say that those missionaries were, oh, that was just a waste, that was no good. I think we tend to say they were still noble in their cause. They still wanted to go after something. And for that reason alone, that shows something within them that has value, that has integrity. So I think even if it's not actualized, it can still hold value and can still hold meaning for you. And I think the way in which you then view your life and view these things can have value. Again, I'm kind of going back to hospice and on the side of those who are dying. But for people that I've been with, one of the most important things for them eventually was, I want to die in a way, for some that I've talked to, I want to die in a way that is a good example for my family. That they can face death courageously or with faith. And so that became very valuable to them. It wasn't about what they can go out and do vocationally, all those things. It was about, how am I going to stand in the midst of something that I cannot change? So that's what I say.
Are there unhealthy ways to grieve?
Absolutely. Turning to risky behaviors. A lot of people think, oh, I have been so good and so faithful my whole life, and then I just watched this person die, and they didn't experience any of this. So now I'm going to go out and, seize the day, carpe diem, and I think for a lot of times that's just delaying the grief process. I'm going to go out, I'm going to have fun, I'm going to enjoy life. And I think, some people do, turn to drugs or alcohol, or people become very angry and very bitter and take it out on people around them, because then they push people away because they don't want to ever experience that pain again that they've just experienced. They're like, I'm going to get everybody away from me because I don't ever want to go through this again.
So a question came in about people continuing to grieve after the funeral and the attention dies down. How do we keep ministering to them for the long haul?
Well, again, I don't think I have a total comprehensive answer, so you can chime in, of course. I think one of the things is this is related to church, or can you say that again? I'm sorry.
Yeah, it just says people are continuing to grieve after the funeral. How can we, so anyone around them, keep ministering to them for the long haul?
I think kind of what you were talking about earlier, simply checking in and asking about their loved one, I think is very important. In my experience, I've noticed too that when people are grieving, and it was a great point you made earlier, when people tend to drift off and they're no longer as attentive as they once were, people who are grieving will often feel apprehensive to ask for more support. They feel that, I don't want to bother them. They kind of rationalize some of that. Well, I know people are busy. They have their own lives. But really what they're yearning for is for that attention, because grief doesn't just go away. It doesn't go away at all, like we talked about. So there's going to be a need for ongoing support. So I think checking in with them, asking about their loved one, how are you doing today? It could be very simple. It could be just sitting with them, being present with them, asking about important holidays. Is there anything you want us to do to celebrate their life? Is there a cause, something that they used to enjoy or something they were part of? Is there a project they were working on that we can help you finish? Was there a certain illness that is rare or not rare, but there needs to be more awareness about this illness? Can we honor your loved one with you and promote awareness for that? So there are a lot of things I think you can do.
I would add one caveat is one thing not to do is don't constantly ask, how are you today? How is it going? How are you doing? They're tired of answering that question. And they're going to say, oh, I'm okay. But really deep down inside, they want to scream, I'm not okay. But they're not going to say that. And I think people get mentally exhausted from putting on a front for everyone. So checking in can look like just saying, hey, I just wanted you to know you were on my mind today. I was thinking about you, just so they know that you remember and that you didn't forget that they've been through this, even though it's been 6 months or even 2 years or 5 years. And to your point of finding something, something maybe that the loved one in their life did that maybe they're not able to do, stepping in like as a church community or, whatever it may be, and, mowing the lawn or saying, hey, we're going to come by and cut your grass today, or help, with, taking care of, we had a death in our neighborhood and they had a pool, and some of the families in our house, in our neighborhood that had pools that knew how to take care of it said to the wife, like, hey, we're going to come over and take care of the pool because we know that you didn't do that, and stuff like that, to take it off their plate and let them know we're still thinking about you, we're supporting you, but finding creative ways to do that.
Just remember one thing, if it's okay to add. With hospice in particular, there are these ongoing support groups too that are more, you have more formalized ones, but then you have ones that are kind of drop in. And so, if you contact a local hospice and ask if they have these groups going on, they go on for years sometimes. It's the same people. And they meet, once a month to go for lunch. They might meet at the hospice center itself, but it's a very intentional space to check in with each other, see how you're doing, and a lot of friendships can form out of this. So.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's also groups that a lot of churches sponsor called Grief Share, and offering to go with somebody for their first time to one of those groups I think can also be beneficial. And they may not need you to continue to go, but to walk in the door for the first time alone can be terrifying, and a lot of people don't want to do it. So just saying, hey, I found this group. Would you be interested in going? Either it helped me when I went through this, or I know about it. Could I go with you for the first time or a couple of times? I think that can be really helpful to somebody.
So a question came in. How can churches make space to acknowledge grief and losses in their gatherings instead of always being celebratory?
Well, I know we, in my church congregation, we celebrate All Saints Sunday. We make a big, I guess it's a presentation, but like we honor all the lives that have been lost within that year within our church, and remembering them, throughout, and then other losses that have happened. But I think also, some of those events, it might be hard for somebody to come in the first time alone, like, without their spouse or family or things like that. So inviting them to come, or having a group, like a whole life group or Sunday school, go together. Say, hey, we're all going to go to this together, not as couples, things like that. I think it helps them find kind of that new way of being in those spaces with different people.
Yeah, I think there might be space in churches to even train people how to companion others through loss. And I know churches set things up differently. So if you have small groups or small community type of settings where you could have people trained in that, because if you're in small community, then you might be more in touch and they may be more comfortable with you coming to you. But I think too, I think you had mentioned and I think it was maybe preached, the Psalms of Lament was mentioned in the sermon. I think that's a beautiful thing, to even name that, right? To say that in Scripture, there is a book of Lamentations. There are many Psalms of Lament. And so to be, creating that intentional, that it's not all Psalms of praise. I think someone, kind of alluding, right? Psalm 88 is one of the most depressing Psalms you can read, but it's very real. And I think it helps people feel like, oh yeah, it's a reminder God and his people can be in tune with my deep, dark sorrow. And again, it's joining with. And so maybe joining with through message, joining with through training people, joining with the annual remembrances, things of that nature.
As we enter into holidays, how can we help those who have suffered a loss deal with holidays and memories that arise?
I think, again, it's important to recognize that loss and help people to not feel like you can't bring it up, you can't talk about that person. And I don't think it's harmful to say, how can I support you during this holiday? I know that, Christmas was a big deal for, your sister, and you guys shared in this. What can I do to support you in that this year? Is there anything that we can be a part of? Do you want to change a tradition? Can we start a new tradition? But being honest with people and being, willing to, I think we tiptoe around some of those conversations, but just gently saying, what can I do? How can we be there to support you and surround you during this time?
Yeah, and the only thing I would add to that is sometimes you want to do nothing, and that's okay. And to your point, having the right people around you to help support you, it can be very helpful to even have a plan, have a written out plan, or even have a checklist. What I do and do not want for these holidays. So that can be very important. And to give yourself an out, to say, even if I do want to do this, but it ends up being something that's overwhelming for me, I give myself permission, and I ask you, whoever that is, to help me, to kind of give me the exit. That this was actually too much after all, but maybe you don't want to be alone. Maybe you shouldn't be alone. So having that person that's willing to come back home with you, for example, or even if it's retreating to a room, so you have somebody there, or maybe you just need time alone, and just let people know, hey, look, if I'm absent suddenly, I'm over here because it's too much for me.
What are some good resources, books, articles, or websites about grief?
Well, I have one that I go to a lot. Sorry.
Go ahead.
It's called What's Your Grief? They have a lot of free resources, articles, a lot of good things on the holidays, and a lot of other things as well. I would say start there, personally. There's some books out there on theory and things like that, but there's also some practical books on grief. I'll forget some, I'm sure, but one that I really personally like is C.S. Lewis, Grief Observed. It's his writings of the death of his wife. And it's a very real, kind of raw, emotional recounting of his grief. Of course, it's C.S. Lewis, so he still writes amazing when he's very sad and distraught. I can't believe how good he writes even when he's in grief. So, but it's a very good, very just real reflection on his grief. Mourning into Dancing is a faith-based grief book. It's a little longer. There's some by Grief Share that I think are pretty good too. But I would say maybe start with What's Your Grief. It's a great website. It's got a lot of free resources.
And I'll speak to kind of the kid and teen world. One of my favorite books is called The Invisible String. It can be used for a lot of different things, but it helps kids understand that because that person or the object or even pet animal is not here, like we're always still connected to them, because kids don't always understand, like they're gone, so they sometimes think they're very concrete, black and white, like they're no longer a part of my life, they're not there. But it helps them understand, like, you're always connected to all these people, whether you're in a different room, whether I'm at school and you're at work, or whether I'm here on earth and someone else is not. We're still connected, we still have that relationship. So that's a great book that can be used for a lot of things. There's a lot of different books also that are like memory books you can find in it. You can have children or teens can go through and write down that it's like fill in the blank. It prompts them to write about that loved one. And I find those books to be very powerful because children often worry that they're going to forget that person. They're not going to remember them. They're not going to, remember what they sounded like or things that they did. And when they write those books and write in those books and fill in all the things, that helps them for years to go back to that person in that time when they lost them, and they feel connected because they wrote those things as they remembered them in that time. So that's can be a really powerful resource, and there's different versions of them based on the type of loss.
I'm also going to add a similar book called The Invisible Snowman, which is also a very child-friendly book to talk about, right, when a snowman melts and where else you see water reflected in the world, and is a really good resource. At Providence Road, Emily Sanchez now has a list of resources with a variety of kids' books as well that will be coming out with a lot of different topics, but there's a lot of books related to understanding and processing grief for kids as well. For those of you who are online, many of these resources are also posted on our website at prcoc.org. There's a resource section. Some tips of what to say, what not to say are posted. Local resource groups, crisis numbers are also able to be found online on that resource as well. But we are so thankful that you guys joined us tonight and appreciate everyone who came and joined us online, and thank you so much.